Welcome to Historical Legacies. Here, we dive into history's most intriguing stories, unraveling mysteries and uncovering truths from the past. Subscribe to join our journey through time's greatest moments. Idi Amin, a name synonymous with brutality and fear, rose from humble beginnings to become one of the most infamous dictators in African history. His reign over Uganda from 1971 to 1979 was marked by violence, economic collapse, and human rights abuses. This documentary delves into his complex, tyrannical legacy. Part 1. Early life in Kiboko, 1925 to 1946. Idi Amin was born in 1925 in the remote town of Kiboko, located in the northwestern region of Uganda, near the borders of Sudan and the Congo. His family belonged to the Kakwa ethnic group, a small community that lived in the region and practiced Islam. Amin's father, Andreas Nyabayar, converted to Islam and changed his name to Amin Dada. His mother, Asa VIII, worked as a traditional herbalist, which added an element of mysticism to Amin's early life. Growing up, Amin faced numerous challenges typical of rural life in colonial Uganda. Formal education was scarce, and Amin's schooling was limited to Islamic studies in Bombo and a brief attendance at a local school in Legacies. He dropped out before completing primary school, leaving him with minimal literacy skills, a limitation that would follow him throughout his life. Despite this, he displayed a remarkable ability to command attention and inspire those around him. Physically, Amin stood out from a young age. He was tall, strong, and athletically gifted, excelling in traditional sports and later rugby and swimming. These traits made him a natural leader among his peers, and he earned a reputation for his bravery and physical endurance. His physicality and charisma caught the attention of British colonial recruiters who scouted young men for military service. In 1946, Amin enlisted in the King's African Rifles, KAR, a regiment of the British Colonial Army. His decision to join the military was likely influenced by the promise of a steady income and the chance to escape the limited opportunities in Kiboko. Initially assigned as an assistant cook, Amin quickly demonstrated his potential, advancing to active military roles. He gained recognition for his discipline, physical strength, and ability to adapt to the rigors of military life. The King's African Rifles became Amin's training ground for understanding power and authority. Stationed in various parts of East Africa, Amin was exposed to different cultures and gained a broader worldview, albeit from the perspective of colonial subservience. His service during this period involved suppressing anti-colonial uprisings, experiences that shaped his views on rebellion and control. Despite his military advancement, Amin remained connected to his roots in Kiboko. He occasionally visited his family and maintained a strong sense of loyalty to the Kakwa people, a loyalty that would later play a significant role in his leadership style. However, the foundations of his ambition were already forming, as Amin began to recognize the military as a path to power. By 1946, Idi Amin had transitioned from a humble, uneducated boy in Kiboko to a rising figure within the British colonial military system. This period of his life not only honed his physical and leadership skills but also planted the seeds of the ruthlessness that would define his later years. Amin's journey from rural Uganda to military prominence was only the beginning of a complex and turbulent legacy. Part 2. Military service in the King's African Rifles, 1946 to 1961. Idi Amin's entry into the King's African Rifles, KAR, in 1946 marked the beginning of a transformative phase in his life. At first, he served in humble capacities, including as an assistant cook, a position reflecting the racial and hierarchical biases of the colonial military system. However, Amin's extraordinary physical strength, discipline, and adaptability soon caught the attention of his superiors. By the early 1950s, he had risen to the rank of corporal, a significant achievement for a native African soldier in a colonial army. Amin's military career began during a period of unrest in East Africa. He was deployed to Kenya during the Mau Mau uprising in the 1950s, a violent conflict between the British colonial government and the Kikuyu-dominated insurgents. His role involved combating insurgent groups, and his actions during this campaign earned him a reputation for fearlessness but also cruelty. Amin's tendency to use excessive force, including the brutal treatment of prisoners, was noted even by his British commanders. In 1953, Amin's dedication and physical prowess earned him a promotion to sergeant, followed by a series of deployments across East Africa. His responsibilities grew, and he was tasked with training recruits and leading small combat units. This period provided Amin with invaluable experience in leadership and tactical operations, skills he would later use to consolidate power. He also developed a close understanding of the colonial military's organizational structure, which would later help him manipulate Uganda's armed forces. By the late 1950s, Amin had emerged as one of the most prominent African soldiers in the King's African Rifles. His role extended beyond combat, as he often acted as a cultural liaison between British officers and local troops. Despite his success, Amin remained a controversial figure, with allegations of misconduct and excessive violence following him throughout his service. Nonetheless, his loyalty to the colonial administration shielded him from significant repercussions. In 1961, as Uganda approached independence, the British colonial government began promoting Africans to commissioned officer ranks. This was part of a broader strategy to prepare local leadership for the eventual transition of power. Amin was among the few selected for promotion, becoming one of Uganda's first commissioned officers. This milestone was significant not only for Amin but also for Uganda, as it marked the beginning of the Africanization of its military leadership. Amin's tenure in the King's African Rifles was transformative, exposing him to the dynamics of authority, discipline, and violence. It also introduced him to the complexities of balancing loyalty and ambition, a theme that would dominate his political and military career. His experiences during this period shaped his worldview, instilling in him a belief in the power of military force as a tool for governance. By the time Uganda gained independence in 1962, Amin had positioned himself as a key figure within the military hierarchy. His rise from an assistant cook to a commissioned officer was a testament to his determination and cunning. However, his actions during his time in the King's African Rifles also revealed the darker aspects of his character, foreshadowing the brutality that would later define his reign. Part 3: Uganda's Independence and Amin's Rise, 1962 to 1965. Uganda gained its independence from British colonial rule on October 9, 1962, marking a pivotal moment in the nation's history. For Idi Amin, this political transformation presented new opportunities to solidify his influence within the military. At the time, Uganda's first Prime Minister, Milton Obote, sought to establish control over the country's diverse factions, recognizing the military's critical role in maintaining stability. Amin's loyalty and experience as a commissioned officer made him an indispensable ally for Obote. Amin's first major assignment came shortly after independence, when he played a key role in combating rebels in Uganda's northern regions. His effectiveness in suppressing these uprisings earned him further promotions and placed him in charge of key military operations. By 1963, he had become a trusted enforcer for Obote, working behind the scenes to ensure the new government's consolidation of power. Their partnership was solidified through covert operations, including arms smuggling to support separatist movements in neighboring regions, particularly in southern Sudan. The arms smuggling operation highlighted Amin's pragmatism and willingness to operate in morally ambiguous spaces. He was tasked with transporting weapons and supplies to Onyanyaya rebels fighting against the Sudanese government, a move that strengthened ties between Obote's government and the rebels. However, This operation also created a network of clandestine activities that Amin would later exploit for personal gain. His ability to navigate these shadowy dealings while maintaining the trust of Obote showcased his political and military acumen. By 1964, Amin had risen to the rank of deputy commander of the Ugandan army, making him one of the most powerful figures in the country's armed forces. He used his position to cultivate loyalty among soldiers, particularly by favoring recruits from his ethnic Kakwa group and other allied communities. This strategy ensured that he had a strong support base within the military, a critical factor in his eventual seizure of power. Amin also began positioning himself as a populist figure, leveraging his charismatic personality to connect with ordinary Ugandans. Despite their early collaboration, tensions between Obote and Amin began to surface during this period. Amin's growing influence and independent operations raised concerns about his ambitions, particularly as he started to act with increasing autonomy. Obote, who was consolidating power through constitutional changes and political alliances, began to view Amin as both an asset and a potential rival. Their relationship became a delicate balance of mutual dependence and suspicion, setting the stage for future conflict. By the mid-1960s, Amin's rise was emblematic of the challenges facing newly independent Uganda. The military, while essential for stability, also became a vehicle for personal ambition and political maneuvering. Amin's ability to navigate this complex environment with skill and ruthlessness made him a key player in Uganda's post-independence power dynamics. However, his actions during this time also revealed his opportunistic nature, as he prioritized loyalty and control over ideology or ethics. As Uganda's political landscape grew increasingly volatile, Amin's role in the army continued to expand. His growing influence, combined with his strategic alliances and willingness to use force, set the stage for a confrontation with Obote. For now, however, Amin remained a loyal lieutenant, waiting for the right moment to assert his own vision of power. Part 4. Power Struggles and the 1966 Crisis. By the mid-1960s, Uganda's political landscape was fraught with tension as Milton Obote faced increasing opposition to his leadership. The fragile alliances that had been formed at independence began to crumble, fueled by ethnic divisions and competing visions for Uganda's future. Idi Amin, by now a trusted deputy commander in the military, found himself in the midst of these political struggles. Amin's loyalty to Obote was both an asset and a threat, as his growing influence in the military began to overshadow Obote's civilian authority. The crisis reached a boiling point in 1966 when Obote was accused of corruption and favoritism, primarily involving the alleged misappropriation of gold and ivory smuggled from Congo. These accusations were tied to secretive operations carried out by Amin under Obote's orders, creating a direct link between the two figures. As the scandal unfolded, Obote moved to consolidate power, suspending the 1962 constitution and declaring himself president in a coup against his own government. The abrogation of the constitution was met with widespread outrage, particularly from the Buganda Kingdom, Uganda's most powerful traditional monarchy. The Buganda Kingdom, under Kabaka, King Mutesa II, openly resisted Obote's actions, creating a dangerous standoff between the central government and Uganda. Obote responded by ordering a military assault on the Kabaka's palace, an operation that would mark a turning point in Uganda's history. Amin was tasked with leading the attack, which resulted in the destruction of the palace and the exile of Mutesa II. This brutal display of force further cemented Amin's reputation as a ruthless enforcer and heightened tensions between Uganda's ethnic and political factions. The 1966 crisis, often referred to as the Mengo Crisis, left Uganda deeply divided. Obote emerged as the undisputed leader, but his reliance on Amin to execute the assault created a dangerous dynamic. Amin's role in the crisis elevated his standing within the military, as soldiers loyal to him were rewarded with promotions and privileges. This loyalty, combined with Amin's growing popularity among certain ethnic groups, positioned him as a formidable figure in Uganda's political landscape. While Amin's actions during the 1966 crisis solidified his power, they also planted the seeds of mistrust between him and Obote. Obote became increasingly wary of Amin's ambitions, particularly as rumors of Amin's involvement in financial misconduct began to surface. The gold and ivory scandal that had initially implicated both men now became a point of contention, with Obote seeking to distance himself from Amin's activities. Amin, however, continued to operate with relative impunity, leveraging his military influence to maintain his position. The aftermath of the crisis saw Uganda transition into a de facto military dictatorship under Obote's rule. Civil liberties were curtailed, and political opposition was suppressed, creating a climate of fear and uncertainty. Amin, as the head of the military, became the enforcer of this new order, but his growing autonomy made him a potential rival to Obote. The power struggle between the two men would define Uganda's political trajectory in the years to come, setting the stage for a dramatic confrontation. By the end of 1966, Amin had emerged as both a loyal servant and a looming threat to Obote's regime. The delicate balance of power between the two men underscored the volatility of post-independence Uganda, where military strength often trumped political legitimacy. For Amin, the events of the 1966 crisis were a stepping stone toward his ultimate goal, the presidency. Part 5. Amin's ascent to commander of the army, 1967 to 1970. Following the 1966 crisis, Idi Amin continued to consolidate his power within Uganda's military structure. His loyalty to President Milton Obote, though strained by mutual suspicion, ensured that he retained his position as a key figure in the government. In 1967, Amin was promoted to commander of the Ugandan Armed Forces, a role that gave him full control over the military. This promotion marked a significant turning point in Amin's career, as he now wielded authority that rivaled Obote's political power. Amin's new position allowed him to reorganize the army to suit his personal ambitions. He began recruiting soldiers from ethnic groups loyal to him, particularly the Kakwa, Nubian, and West Nile communities. By surrounding himself with loyalists, Amin created a power base that he could rely on in the event of political conflict. This strategy not only strengthened his influence within the military but also deepened divisions within the institution. These divisions would later play a critical role in shaping Uganda's political instability. During this period, Amin also expanded his network of international contacts. He maintained strong ties with Israel, which provided training and equipment to Uganda's military in exchange for political support. Amin's interactions with Israeli officials further enhanced his understanding of military tactics and modern warfare. Simultaneously, he cultivated relationships with Arab nations, particularly Libya, positioning himself as a mediator in regional conflicts. This dual alignment with opposing blocs demonstrated Amin's pragmatism and opportunism in pursuing personal and national interests. Despite his growing power, Amin's relationship with Obote continued to deteriorate. Obote became increasingly paranoid about Amin's ambitions, particularly as Amin's popularity within the military and among certain ethnic groups grew. In response, Obote began to sideline Amin from key political decisions, attempting to curtail his influence. However, Amin's control of the army made it difficult for Obote to completely isolate him. This uneasy coexistence created a volatile political climate, with both men maneuvering to outwit the other. A key source of tension between the two was the unresolved issue of the gold and ivory smuggling scandal. Obote, wary of Amin's financial dealings, initiated an investigation into military corruption, indirectly targeting Amin. In turn, Amin sought to undermine Obote by solidifying his alliances within the military and cultivating support among discontented politicians. the rivalry between the two leaders became an open secret, with many predicting an inevitable confrontation. By 1970, Amin's position as commander of the army had become a double-edged sword for Obote. While Amin's leadership ensured the military remained functional, his growing autonomy posed a significant threat to Obote's authority. The president's attempts to balance this power dynamic only fueled further animosity between the two. Meanwhile, Amin's public image as a charismatic and decisive leader continued to grow, earning him support among ordinary Ugandans who were disillusioned with Obote's increasingly authoritarian rule. As the decade drew to a close, Uganda stood on the brink of political upheaval. Amin's ascent to the top of the military hierarchy had made him a central figure in the nation's power structure, while his relationship with Obote had reached a breaking point. For Amin, the question was no longer if he would challenge Obote's rule but when and how. Part 6. The coup of 1971. Amin's seizure of power. The political tension between Idi Amin and President Milton Obote finally reached its breaking point in January 1971. Over the years, Amin had built a power base within the military, but Obote's increasing mistrust and efforts to isolate him had pushed him to act. The immediate catalyst for Amin's coup was a planned foreign trip by Obote to Singapore and other countries. Amin saw this as an opportunity to strike, as Obote's absence left a temporary vacuum in power. On the morning of January 25, 1971, while Obote was abroad, Amin launched his military coup with the support of key officers and soldiers loyal to him. The operation was swift and largely bloodless, with Amin's forces taking control of key government buildings, radio stations, and military barracks. Obote's government was caught off guard, and within hours, the president's leadership collapsed. Amin declared himself Uganda's new leader, promising to restore stability and economic prosperity. In the aftermath of the coup, Amin moved quickly to solidify his control over the government. The coup was presented as a patriotic uprising, with Amin positioning himself as a champion of the Ugandan people. He abolished the 1967 constitution and dissolved the National Assembly, assuming full executive power. Amin's initial promises of a better Uganda resonated with many, as he claimed to champion the rights of the poor, the marginalized, and the military. Amin's first actions as president were to purge Obote's loyalists from key positions in the military and government. He moved rapidly to eliminate potential rivals, with many Obote supporters either arrested or forced into exile. In one of his most notorious acts, Amin ordered the execution of dozens of high-ranking officials, including former ministers and military officers. These purges sent a chilling message to those who might challenge his authority. Amin's coup was also marked by a shift in Uganda's foreign policy. He broke off ties with Israel, which had been a key supporter of the Ugandan military, and aligned the country with Arab nations, particularly Libya and Egypt. This shift signaled Amin's ambitions to position Uganda as a leader of Pan-African and anti-imperialist movements. The change in foreign alliances was also motivated by Amin's desire to secure military and financial support from Arab states, which would further cement his rule. As the weeks passed, Amin consolidated his power by filling government positions with his own supporters and military allies. He also imposed strict censorship on the press, silencing opposition voices and limiting the flow of information. The Ugandan public, initially hopeful for change, soon began to see the darker side of Amin's rule. His regime was marked by growing authoritarianism, corruption, and a terrifying climate of fear. Amin's rise to power signaled a turning point in Uganda's history. His coup not only ended Obote's rule but also ushered in a new era of political instability and violence. While Amin initially presented himself as a liberator, his brutal tactics and oppressive policies soon began to tarnish his image. The stage was now set for a regime that would be defined by cruelty, paranoia, and devastating miscalculations. Part 7. The Consolidation of Power and the Early Years of Amin's Regime, 1971 to 1973. After seizing power in January 1971, Idi Amin moved swiftly to consolidate his authority and eliminate any threats to his rule. His first priority was to secure the loyalty of Uganda's military, which had played a central role in his coup. Amin rewarded his supporters with promotions and key government positions, ensuring that his allies controlled the critical levers of power. His strongman tactics, however, soon led to growing unrest as the civilian population began to feel the effects of his authoritarian rule. Amin's efforts to consolidate power included the systematic purging of perceived political enemies, particularly those associated with the Obote regime. He established a secret police force, which was instrumental in tracking and eliminating dissidents. Dissidents, real or imagined, were often subjected to brutal interrogations, torture, and summary executions. Fear permeated the country as Amin's regime instilled an atmosphere of terror, with even the slightest sign of opposition leading to imprisonment or death. In the early years of his rule, Amin presented himself as a revolutionary hero, one who had liberated Uganda from the oppressive rule of Obote. He made public statements emphasizing his commitment to improving the lives of ordinary Ugandans, particularly by reducing corruption and promoting national unity. Despite these promises, Amin's administration was characterized by cronyism, as he filled key government and military positions with his ethnic supporters. His reliance on a network of loyalists meant that ethnic favoritism became a hallmark of his regime, leading to further divisions within Ugandan society. One of the most notable aspects of Amin's early rule was his attempts to nationalize industries and seize foreign-owned businesses. In 1972, he announced the expulsion of all Asians from Uganda, accusing them of economic exploitation and undermining the Ugandan economy. This decision had disastrous consequences, as many of the expelled Asians were skilled workers and entrepreneurs who had previously played a significant role in Uganda's economy. The expulsion led to widespread economic collapse, as the businesses and industries left behind by the expelled population were poorly managed or dismantled. Despite the economic downturn, Amin continued to portray himself as a leader of anti-imperialism, rallying against Western and colonial powers. He sought support from Arab nations, especially Libya, which provided financial and military aid to Amin's regime. Amin's alignment with Libya was rooted in shared ideological interests, as both leaders sought to challenge Western influence in Africa. This alliance, however, also served to further isolate Uganda on the global stage, as many Western countries condemned Amin's policies and human rights abuses. Internally, Amin's early years were marked by a strange mix of nationalism and militarism. He took on the title of President for Life in 1973, cementing his grip on power and signaling his intent to rule without opposition. Amin also began to style himself as a grand figure of African unity and liberation, seeking to present himself as a champion of Africa's independence and sovereignty. His rhetoric, however, was increasingly at odds with the reality of his oppressive and unpredictable rule. The early years of Amin's regime were also defined by increasing instability and violence. With a rapidly growing military budget, Amin's government sought to project power, but the country's economy suffered as a result of his policies. Uganda became a pariah state, isolated from many Western countries that had once been important trading partners. Despite this, Amin's grip on power remained strong, as he used military might to crush any dissent and portrayed himself as an African revolutionary fighting for the continent's freedom. Part 8. The Expulsion of Asians and Economic Collapse, 1972 to 1973. In 1972, Idi Amin made one of the most controversial decisions of his rule when he announced the expulsion of Uganda's Asian population. The move was presented as a way to reclaim Uganda's economy from foreign control, with Amin accusing the Asian community of exploiting the nation's resources and holding too much economic power. He ordered that all Asians, whether citizens or not, leave the country within 90 days. The decision had profound social, economic, and political consequences, and it marked a significant turning point in Amin's regime. Amin's rhetoric portrayed the expulsion as a bold stand against colonial legacy and imperialism. He framed it as an act of liberation, a reclaiming of Uganda's sovereignty and national identity. The expulsion primarily targeted Ugandan Indians, many of whom had been in the country for generations and were integral to the nation's economy, owning businesses, shops, and factories. Amin's populist justification resonated with some segments of the population who viewed the Asians as outsiders, though many were unaware of the devastating consequences this move would have on Uganda's economy. In practice, the expulsion was chaotic and poorly organized. Thousands of Asians were forced to leave their homes, with little time to sell their properties or businesses. This led to the destruction of many thriving enterprises, as those who took over the businesses often lacked the experience or expertise to manage them effectively. The loss of the Asian community, which had been an essential part of Uganda's commercial sector, plunged the economy into a severe crisis. Inflation skyrocketed, shortages of goods became widespread, and unemployment reached record levels. Amin's decision was also met with international condemnation, particularly from the United Kingdom, where many of the expelled Ugandans had family ties. The UK government responded by offering asylum to thousands of refugees, but many Ugandans, including skilled workers and entrepreneurs, were left stranded with no means of support. Amin's attempt to seize Asian-owned properties further alienated Uganda from the international community, especially Western countries. Despite these repercussions, Amin remained defiant, insisting that his actions were a necessary step toward Uganda's independence and economic freedom. The economic collapse that followed the expulsion of Asians was catastrophic for Uganda. Without the expertise and investment of the Asian community, the Ugandan economy stagnated, and industries that had once been successful fell into disarray. Agricultural exports, which were once a key pillar of the economy, dwindled as mismanagement and corruption crippled production. The economy spiraled downward, and many Ugandans found themselves struggling to survive in a country that was rapidly descending into poverty and instability. Amin's political base within the military, however, remained loyal, and he continued to focus on expanding his power while stoking nationalist sentiments. His public statements continued to emphasize his anti-colonial and anti-imperialist stance, positioning himself as a hero of Africa. The failure of his economic policies, however, became increasingly difficult to ignore. The growing poverty, lack of basic goods, and widespread unemployment put immense pressure on his regime, but Amin's grip on power remained strong due to his control over the military. The expulsion of Asians and the subsequent economic collapse marked the beginning of a long period of decline for Uganda under Amin's rule. While Amin sought to maintain an image of strength and defiance, the reality was that the nation was unraveling under his leadership. The short-term political gains he made by targeting the Asian community ultimately came at a devastating cost, and Uganda's economy would take decades to recover from the damage caused during this period. Part 9. The Decline of International Relations and Amin's Paranoia, 1973 to 1974. As Amin's regime continued to flounder under economic collapse and internal unrest, his relationship with the international community rapidly deteriorated. The expulsion of Asians, along with his increasingly erratic behavior, led many nations to sever diplomatic ties with Uganda. Western powers, particularly the United Kingdom and the United States, condemned Amin's policies, and foreign aid to Uganda ceased. This marked a significant shift, as Amin's early attempts to position Uganda as an anti-imperialist leader in Africa began to unravel. Amin's defiant rhetoric and actions alienated much of the global community, but he sought to compensate for this by building new alliances with countries in the Arab world. In particular, Libya, under the leadership of Muammar Gaddafi, became one of Amin's most steadfast supporters. Gaddafi's ideological alignment with Amin, particularly their shared anti-Western stance and Pan-African sentiments, strengthened their bilateral relations. Libya provided Uganda with military aid and support, bolstering Amin's regime and enabling him to maintain control over the military. Despite these alliances, Uganda's isolation grew, and Amin began to feel the weight of mounting international criticism. His paranoia about potential foreign interference escalated, leading to a further clampdown on civil liberties and dissent within Uganda. Amin's control over the country grew more absolute, and his methods of governance became increasingly erratic. He surrounded himself with a small group of trusted advisors, many of whom were military officers from his ethnic group, and increasingly relied on secret police to manage internal opposition. The fear of overthrow was a constant presence in Amin's leadership, and his paranoia extended to both foreign and domestic threats. His government began to target anyone deemed a potential rival, including political figures, military leaders, intellectuals, and even members of his own family. It became clear that Amin would stop at nothing to eliminate anyone who might challenge his authority, leading to widespread purges and executions. This cycle of violence and fear, driven by Amin's suspicion of betrayal, deepened Uganda's instability and intensified the suffering of the population. In 1974, Uganda's isolation on the world stage was cemented as most nations chose to distance themselves from Amin's government. The United Nations condemned Uganda's human rights violations, and the international community began to view Amin's regime as a pariah state. Amin's increasingly erratic and violent behavior reinforced this image, further cutting Uganda off from potential foreign partners. However, Amin's paranoia and desire to retain control meant that he was unwilling to soften his approach or engage in diplomatic dialogue with the outside world. Internally, the situation worsened as Uganda's economy continued to spiral into decline. The loss of international trade, coupled with Amin's unpredictable policies, led to food shortages, inflation, and widespread poverty. Despite the economic hardships, Amin's regime continued to prioritize military spending and his own personal security, further draining the country's resources. The military, although loyal to Amin, began to suffer from low morale as soldiers were sent on poorly equipped and poorly planned missions, which resulted in increasing casualties. The deteriorating economic situation, coupled with rising political violence and repression, led many Ugandans to question the future of Amin's regime. While the government's propaganda machine continued to glorify Amin's leadership, the gap between the regime's rhetoric and the harsh realities on the ground grew wider. Amin's image as a revolutionary hero began to crack, and his leadership increasingly appeared to be driven by self-preservation rather than any meaningful vision for Uganda's future. Part 10. The conflict with Tanzania and the invasion of 1978. In 1978, tensions between Uganda and neighboring Tanzania escalated into full-blown conflict, marking a pivotal moment in Idi Amin's rule. The roots of the conflict lay in Amin's increasing territorial ambitions, as well as his strained relationship with Tanzania's president, Julius Nyerere. Amin had long viewed Nyerere as a rival, particularly after Nyerere openly criticized his regime and its human rights abuses. The two countries' relations soured further when Amin attempted to seize the Kagera River region, a disputed area on the border between Uganda and Tanzania. On October 29, 1978, Amin launched an invasion of Tanzania, claiming that Ugandan forces had been provoked by Tanzanian incursions. The invasion was swift but poorly planned, and it was soon clear that Uganda's military was ill-equipped and demoralized. Amin's forces were met with stiff resistance from Tanzania's well-prepared military, which was supported by anti-Amin Ugandan exiles. Within weeks, Tanzanian forces pushed the Ugandan army back into Uganda, reclaiming the disputed Kagera region and taking control of key Ugandan territory. The war with Tanzania exposed the weaknesses of Amin's regime and military. Despite initial bravado, it became apparent that Amin's forces were no match for the better-trained and more disciplined Tanzanian army. Amin's military was plagued by internal divisions, poor logistics, and a lack of morale, which made it difficult to sustain any significant advances. Meanwhile, Amin's political position in Uganda continued to deteriorate as his military failed to achieve its objectives. Amin's initial military successes were short-lived, and by November 1978, Tanzanian forces had launched a counteroffensive that sent Ugandan troops fleeing. In addition to military pressure, Amin faced growing dissent within Uganda, where citizens began to view his leadership as a liability rather than a source of strength. The Tanzanian forces, with the help of Ugandan exiles, advanced into Uganda, eventually reaching Kampala by April 1979. The momentum of the Tanzanian invasion, combined with internal revolts, marked the beginning of the end for Amin's regime. The war with Tanzania further isolated Uganda on the international stage, with even former supporters beginning to question Amin's leadership. His earlier alliances with countries such as Libya and other Arab states were put under strain as Uganda's military fortunes deteriorated. The economic situation worsened as the conflict diverted resources away from the already struggling economy, further exacerbating food shortages, inflation, and poverty. Amin's desperation to retain power became evident as he attempted to rally his supporters with inflammatory rhetoric and false claims of victory. However, the reality of the situation became impossible to deny as Uganda's capital city, Kampala, fell to Tanzanian forces. Amin's military collapse was accompanied by widespread desertion and internal chaos, as many Ugandans took the opportunity to rebel against his oppressive regime. Amin's paranoia deepened, but it was clear that the military was no longer willing to fight for him. By the time Tanzanian forces entered Uganda's capital, Amin had already fled the country, seeking refuge in Libya. His regime, once marked by fear, brutality, and a facade of strength, came to an abrupt and ignominious end. The loss of the Kagera region and the subsequent invasion exposed the fragility of Amin's leadership, both militarily and politically. The fall of Kampala marked the end of an era, and Amin's once powerful reign was reduced to a chaotic and violent collapse. Part 11: Exile in Saudi Arabia and the Legacy of Amin's Rule. After fleeing Uganda in April 1979, Idi Amin sought refuge in Libya before eventually being granted asylum by Saudi Arabia. The Saudi government welcomed Amin, offering him a place in exile, where he would spend the remainder of his life. Despite the lavish surroundings of his new life, Amin's departure from Uganda marked a definitive end to his reign, and his departure did little to diminish the suffering and chaos left in his wake. Amin's exile in Saudi Arabia was marked by a period of relative isolation. Although he occasionally spoke to the press, he was no longer the powerful figure he had once been. In Saudi Arabia, Amin lived in relative obscurity, with few visitors and limited public interaction. His former arrogance and bravado were replaced by a sense of regret, as his legacy in Uganda remained defined by violence, oppression, and the economic ruin he had left behind. The years in exile did little to rehabilitate Amin's image. His reputation as a brutal dictator remained firmly entrenched, and the atrocities committed under his rule continued to haunt both Uganda and the international community. Amin's involvement in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Ugandans during his reign, through executions, torture, and disappearances, ensured that his name would be forever associated with cruelty. Although Amin occasionally claimed he was misunderstood or that he had been a victim of foreign conspiracy, these assertions did little to change the perception of his rule. Amin's legacy in Uganda was marked by deep scars. The country had been left in ruins, with an economy that was crippled by years of mismanagement, war, and isolation. Millions of Ugandans had fled the country during his reign, many of them never returning. The scars of his brutal rule and the widespread destruction of Uganda's political institutions would take decades to heal. In Saudi Arabia, Amin lived a life of luxury, but his actions in Uganda continued to define him. Despite the comfort of his exile was a reminder that his reign had left a country in tatters, with a population broken by years of violence and fear. Amin's isolation in the Desert Kingdom was a stark contrast to the power he had once wielded. His rule in Uganda had been characterized by megalomania and paranoia, but his final years offered no redemption, as his deeds and policies had created a permanent shadow over Uganda's history. In the years following Amin's departure, Uganda slowly began to rebuild under new leadership. However, the damage done during Amin's regime remained a constant challenge. His time in power had left deep divisions within the country, and many of the policies he enacted, including the expulsion of Asians and the brutal suppression of opposition, would continue to have long-lasting effects on Uganda's social and economic structure. Despite his fall from power and years in exile, Amin's name remains synonymous with the brutality of dictatorship. The memory of his rule continues to serve as a reminder of the destructive potential of unchecked power. Idi Amin's regime stands as one of the darkest periods in Uganda's history, and his exile in Saudi Arabia did little to erase the trauma caused by his actions. When Amin died in 2003, his legacy remained one of terror, instability, and loss. He was buried in Saudi Arabia, far from the country he had once ruled with an iron fist. Despite his eventual death, the impact of his time in power is still felt in Uganda, where his legacy continues to be debated and remembered. Idi Amin's rule, though over, left a legacy that Uganda has struggled to overcome ever since. Part 12. The Aftermath of Amin's Rule and Uganda's Path to Recovery. The aftermath of Idi Amin's brutal regime left Uganda in a state of profound devastation, and recovery seemed almost impossible. In the wake of his departure in 1979, the country was left with an economy in tatters, institutions destroyed, and an entire generation scarred by years of violence and fear. The destruction of Uganda's political system during Amin's rule left a power vacuum that led to further instability and conflict, as various factions fought for control of the nation. Amin's reign had decimated Uganda's once thriving industries, and the expulsion of Asians, along with his economic mismanagement, led to a severe collapse in the country's economic structure. The loss of skilled labor, coupled with the dissolution of businesses and a lack of international investment, created a desperate situation for the citizens of Uganda. The lack of infrastructure, corruption, and continued conflict made recovery difficult, and Uganda struggled to rebuild its economy in the decades following Amin's departure. The human toll of Amin's rule was immeasurable, with an estimated 300,000 to 500,000 Ugandans killed during his time in power. Countless others were tortured, displaced, or subjected to inhumane conditions. The psychological and emotional scars left by Amin's reign were profound, and many Ugandans faced deep trauma that affected generations. The country was not only rebuilding physically but was also grappling with the psychological effects of the widespread violence that had permeated everyday life. In the years following Amin's departure, Uganda's political landscape was unstable, with frequent changes in leadership and power struggles between various factions. The Tanzanian-backed government that took over in 1979 was soon replaced by other military-led governments, further contributing to the chaos. It wasn't until the 1980s, under the leadership of Yoweri Museveni, that Uganda began a slow process of stabilization and recovery. Museveni's National Resistance Movement, NRM, managed to secure control of the country after years of civil war, but the legacy of Amin's brutality continued to haunt the nation's efforts to rebuild. Amin's expulsion of Asians in 1972 had long-lasting consequences for Uganda's economy. Many of those expelled were skilled entrepreneurs, doctors, and professionals, and their absence left a significant gap in the economy. Rebuilding businesses and attracting foreign investment proved difficult, as Uganda had become a pariah state in the eyes of the international community. It wasn't until the 1990s that Uganda began to see some economic growth, driven by reforms and external assistance. Socially, Uganda faced the difficult task of healing from the divisions and ethnic tensions that had been exacerbated during Amin's reign. Amin's policy of ethnic favoritism had created deep fractures in the country, and rebuilding national unity was a slow and painful process. The trauma inflicted by years of violence, mass executions, and forced disappearances led to a society that was fractured and suspicious. Efforts to reconcile and heal were complicated by the absence of a comprehensive reckoning with Amin's crimes, as many perpetrators of his regime still held positions of power in post-Amin Uganda. Despite these challenges, Uganda slowly began to rebuild its political institutions. The transition to civilian rule in the 1980s was a difficult one, but Uganda began to move toward greater political stability under Museveni's leadership. Museveni sought to address some of the historical injustices caused by Amin's regime by implementing reforms aimed at healing the nation's divisions. This included efforts to provide justice for the victims of Amin's regime, although the legacy of Amin's brutality would continue to cast a long shadow over Uganda's political and social life. As Uganda continued its recovery, the legacy of Idi Amin remained a reminder of the dangers of authoritarian rule and unchecked power. The scars of his rule continue to shape the national consciousness, and his time in power is still a subject of intense debate within Uganda. Although Uganda has made progress in rebuilding and stabilizing its economy, the damage caused by Amin's regime cannot be easily erased. The country's painful history under Amin serves as a stark warning for future generations about the importance of democracy, human rights, and the need for accountable leadership. Part 13. Uganda's struggles with justice and accountability. In the years following Idi Amin's departure, Uganda faced a significant challenge: how to confront the atrocities of his regime and ensure justice for the victims of his brutal rule. The lack of accountability for Amin's crimes left a gaping hole in Uganda's post-conflict reconstruction, as many of his former supporters and collaborators remained in positions of power. There was no truth commission to provide a comprehensive reckoning with the past, and the absence of justice further compounded the wounds left by Amin's reign. The absence of a clear process for dealing with Amin's atrocities stemmed from political complexities and the ongoing instability in Uganda after his fall. Military-backed governments, including those that emerged in the 1980s and 1990s, were reluctant to address the crimes of the past, fearing that doing so might undermine their own legitimacy. In particular, many former members of Amin's military and security forces continued to hold influential roles in post-Amin Uganda, making any comprehensive reckoning difficult. Efforts to seek justice for Amin's victims faced significant roadblocks, and for years, no major trials or prosecutions were initiated. The few attempts at holding Amin's regime accountable were limited, and those who survived the violence had little recourse for justice. The International Criminal Court, ICC, which would later play a role in prosecuting crimes against humanity in other African nations, did not have jurisdiction over Amin's actions, as the crimes occurred before the court was established. While Uganda made some efforts to reckon with its past, these were often piecemeal and incomplete. In the 1990s, Uganda's government began to address some of the human rights abuses of the Amin era, but these initiatives were often overshadowed by ongoing conflicts and economic difficulties. The government's focus remained on rebuilding the country and stabilizing the economy, leaving justice for Amin's victims on the back burner. In the absence of a nationwide approach to justice, many victims of Amin's regime felt that their suffering had been ignored. At the same time, the wounds of Amin's rule remained fresh for many Ugandans, and the desire for justice remained strong among survivors and their families. The international community, including human rights organizations, called for accountability and urged the Ugandan government to take more substantial steps to address the past. However, political and social divisions in Uganda, as well as the legacy of Amin's own military apparatus, complicated efforts to pursue justice. There were also fears that opening old wounds might destabilize the country, which had only recently emerged from the chaos of Amin's rule. Despite these challenges, some limited efforts to seek justice did emerge. In the 1990s, the Ugandan government established a human rights commission that aimed to investigate the crimes committed during Amin's regime. However, the commission's efforts were constrained by a lack of resources and political will, and many high-profile cases went unaddressed. Those responsible for the worst atrocities, including Amin himself, were never prosecuted, and many survivors continued to suffer from the trauma of their experiences without any formal recognition or reparations. As Uganda moved into the 21st century, the question of justice for Amin's victims remained unresolved. The government began to shift its focus to economic development, but the legacy of Amin's regime remained a significant obstacle to national reconciliation. Without a formal mechanism for dealing with the past, the country struggled to move forward, as the memories of Amin's brutality continued to haunt the collective consciousness of the Ugandan people. While Uganda made strides toward political stability under the leadership of Yoweri Museveni, the shadow of Amin's legacy remained. The continued presence of former members of Amin's military and government in key positions of power served as a constant reminder of the unresolved past. For many Ugandans, justice remained elusive, and the full scope of Amin's crimes had yet to be confronted. As the country struggled to reconcile with its past, the lack of justice and accountability for Amin's atrocities continued to hinder Uganda's progress toward true national healing. Part 14. The role of international community in Uganda's healing. The international community played a critical role in Uganda's long process of healing, though its involvement was often limited and sometimes delayed. Following the fall of Idi Amin's regime, many foreign governments, including those from the United Nations and various human rights organizations, called for accountability and supported efforts to address the horrors of the past. However, the path toward justice for Amin's victims was slow, and much of the pressure for reform came from outside Uganda. International support for Uganda's recovery was initially focused on humanitarian aid, with a strong emphasis on rebuilding infrastructure and providing basic needs. The immediate aftermath of Amin's rule left the country devastated, and global organizations, including the UN and the World Bank, poured resources into helping Uganda recover from the economic and social collapse. While these efforts provided short-term relief, they often failed to address the deep-rooted issues of justice and accountability for Amin's regime, leaving many victims feeling abandoned by the international community. The United Nations, in particular, called for a broader reckoning with the past. However, the UN's involvement was often limited by Uganda's sovereignty and by political considerations within the country itself. The lack of a formal truth commission or justice mechanism meant that the international community's efforts to push for accountability were often ineffective. Nonetheless, organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the International Federation for Human Rights took up the cause of the victims of Amin's reign, drawing international attention to the lack of justice in Uganda. The international community's efforts were complicated by the fact that Uganda's government often resisted external pressure for accountability. Ugandan officials feared that a focus on Amin's crimes would undermine the government's legitimacy, particularly as many members of the government had links to Amin's regime. Furthermore, political instability and regional conflicts, including the ongoing conflict in neighboring Rwanda and Sudan, diverted global attention away from Uganda's internal struggles. As a result, the Ugandan government took little substantive action toward holding Amin's regime accountable for the atrocities committed under his rule. In the 1990s, international pressure on Uganda to address its past intensified. International courts, including the International Criminal Court (ICC), had begun to take a more active role in prosecuting crimes against humanity, and the world began to expect Uganda to follow suit. Despite these calls for action, Uganda's government remained reluctant to pursue formal trials for Amin's crimes, fearing that this would destabilize the country's fragile peace. The absence of any major international efforts to bring Amin's collaborators to justice underscored the limited role of the international community in the healing process. Nevertheless, the international community's role in Uganda's recovery wasn't entirely passive. Various international non-governmental organizations, NGOs, played a pivotal role in helping survivors of Amin's regime. These organizations provided psychological support, humanitarian aid, and assistance to the families of those who had been affected by Amin's violence. They also helped educate the public about the atrocities committed during Amin's rule and advocated for the creation of a comprehensive truth-telling process in Uganda. International involvement also brought increased attention to the need for political reform and democratization in Uganda. Global pressure encouraged the government to embrace reforms, leading to the eventual establishment of multi-party elections in the 1990s. However, despite these positive developments, Uganda's healing process remained incomplete. While political and economic stabilization occurred over time, the absence of justice for the crimes of Amin's regime continued to weigh heavily on the nation. The international community's role in Uganda's healing journey highlighted the complex relationship between global pressure, domestic politics, and post-conflict recovery. As Uganda worked to rebuild itself, the lessons learned from Amin's regime and the continued calls for accountability served as a reminder of the need for both national and international commitment to justice and reconciliation. Without comprehensive international and domestic efforts to address the crimes of the past, Uganda's healing remained partial, and the legacy of Amin's brutality continued to shape the country's trajectory. Part 15. The Enduring Legacy of Idi Amin. Despite his death in 2003, Idi Amin's impact on Uganda endures, as his reign left deep scars that continue to shape the country's present. Amin's legacy is one of violence, fear, and destruction, and the trauma of his brutal dictatorship remains fresh for many survivors. While Uganda has made significant strides in rebuilding, the long-term consequences of his rule persist, influencing both the country's politics and its social fabric. Amin's reign is a somber chapter in Uganda's history, marked by widespread human rights abuses, economic mismanagement, and political instability. The psychological scars of his regime, particularly for those who lived through the violence, continue to affect generations of Ugandans. Many families were torn apart by Amin's policies, and for many, the search for justice remains unresolved. His brutal approach to governance and the paranoia-driven purges that defined his rule created lasting divisions within Ugandan society. The post-Amin era was shaped by the task of rebuilding a fractured nation. Uganda's leaders, particularly under Yoweri Museveni, sought to stabilize the country and heal its wounds, but the shadow of Amin's brutality looms large. The decades of instability and violence created by Amin's rule set back Uganda's development, and the scars left by his regime continue to hinder the country's progress. Despite these challenges, Uganda has gradually moved toward greater political and economic stability, yet the trauma of Amin's reign is woven into the nation's collective memory. Amin's legacy is not only remembered in Uganda, but his name is also synonymous with dictatorial violence on the global stage. International human rights organizations, along with the broader world community, continue to reflect on the atrocities committed during his time in power, ensuring that the lessons of his rule are not forgotten. The impact of his regime has influenced the way in which other nations approach issues of human rights, justice, and accountability. Though Amin's reign is over, his legacy serves as a constant reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the human cost of dictatorial rule. In Uganda today, the memory of Amin is preserved through both personal testimony and national remembrance. Survivors of his regime continue to share their stories, and the memories of the atrocities committed during his time in power remain etched in the collective consciousness. Monuments, museums, and memorials have been established to remember the victims of Amin's rule, although some remain contentious in a country still wrestling with its painful past. The challenge of reconciling with this dark chapter in history is ongoing, as many Ugandans still seek answers, justice, and closure. The transition from Amin's brutal dictatorship to a more stable Uganda is a testament to the resilience of its people. While much work remains to be done in terms of justice and national healing, Uganda has made significant strides toward recovery. Amin's rule serves as a constant reminder of the fragility of democracy and the devastating consequences of political repression. In this sense, his legacy remains a vital part of Uganda's journey toward peace, justice, and reconciliation. Even as Uganda moves forward, the lessons learned from Amin's time in power continue to inform the nation's governance and political culture. The fight for justice for Amin's victims is far from over, and efforts to ensure that such atrocities are never repeated are ongoing. The memory of his reign serves as a warning, a reminder that the horrors of the past should never be forgotten if true healing is to take place. Uganda's future, shaped by the lessons of its past, remains in the hands of its people, who continue to work toward a better and more just society. Thanks for tuning in to Historical Legacies. If you enjoyed this dive into history, please like, subscribe, and share. Join us next time for more fascinating stories from the past.